Take a map of South America, find the only English-speaking country, Guyana. Now, watch its politics. It looks like chaos, a feud, two majorities, black and Indian, locked in a fight for the soul of the state. You'll be told that this is ancient, that these wounds are tribal, that this is just how it is. That is not an explanation, it is a cover story. This conflict has a history. It was designed, it was manufactured with the cold precision of an engineering blueprint. The story of Guyana is the story of a poisoned gift. It asks the most vicious question a former slave colony can face. What happens after freedom? If freedom comes without power, without land, without a true stake in the nation you built. What's happening in Guyana is not a spontaneous conflict. It is the final political stage of a system that began on the sugar plantation. A system that, when it could no longer own black bodies outright, perfected a subtler, more dangerous weapon: division. This is the story of how the struggle for liberation was expertly rerouted into a war between communities, how the fight for a country became a fight over the country, leaving black Guyanese in a relentless battle to retain the place they had won. This is what happened to the black people in Guyana. To understand the political war, you must first visit the factory floor where it was engineered. Forget quaint ideas of colonialism. British Guyana, and before that Dutch Guyana, was a different kind of machine. It was a geographic lockbox, bordered by the Atlantic Ocean on one side and impenetrable jungles on the others. It was designed for one export and one import. Sugar out, enslaved Africans in. This was a society that produced sugar, but it was also a sugar mill that accidentally produced a graveyard. The humidity crushed lungs. The cane fields hid snakes. The grinding rollers caught limbs. The plantation was a slow industrial death, and its fuel was black life. And in 1763, in the Berbice region, the fuel decided to burn down a factory. The spark was a man named Kofi, an Akan name, a warrior's name. He was a strategist. When the rebellion ignited, he formed a government. For over a year, Kofi and his forces controlled the colony. They drafted letters to the Dutch governor, not begging for mercy, but negotiating terms. Their demand was revolutionary: freedom and sovereignty over the land they had worked. They wanted a partitioned Berbice, a black state. This was the first foundational political claim of black Guyana. Freedom is meaningless without territory. The rebellion was eventually crushed. Kofi, rather than face capture, is said to have taken his own life. But the idea did not die. It went underground into the collective memory of every enslaved person who bent their back in those cane fields. This land is also ours. 75 years later, the British Empire, pressured by abolitionists, finally signed emancipation in 1838. And here came the second, more bureaucratic betrayal. The British government allocated the astronomical sum of 20 million, billions in today's money, in compensation. It was paid not to the freed, but to the enslavers, a reimbursement for their lost property. The 80,000 newly free Guyanese, they walked out of the gates with nothing. No land grant, no seed money, no reparations for centuries of stolen labor and dismembered lineages. They were free in an economy meticulously designed for their captivity. The plantation owners still owned the land, the mills, and the ports. The freed owned only the clothes on their backs and the strength in their hands, the very strength that had just been priced and sold to their former masters. So, they faced the challenge of survival, and their solution would be an act of breathtaking defiance. They decided to buy the master's house. The freed people of Guyana performed an act of economic and political genius. They turned their only asset, their collective labor, into a weapon of liberation. They pooled their wages and formed friendly societies, credit unions, communal banks, decades before such concepts were formalized. And they began to buy, not scraps of land. They bought the entire system that had confined them. When sugar prices crashed, plantation owners abandoned marginal estates. The freed Africans pooled their resources and bought them. Plaisance, Victoria, Buxton, they purchased the very plantations whose names were synonymous with their oppression. This was the village movement, and it was a revolution. Within a decade, they had bought over 100 estates. By 1851, nearly 40,000 people, half the free population, lived in independent freehold villages. They were building a parallel society. They elected their own village councils, founded their own schools, and grew food for their own markets, not for export. They created a black land-owning, independent voting class. This was the nightmare of every colonial planner: a substantial black population with economic sovereignty and political power. In London and in the planter mansions of Georgetown, the panic was palpable. Their books told a terrifying story. Labor was getting expensive, and worse, it was getting independent. The colonial machine required a dependent, cheap, and divided workforce. The village movement was proving that a united free people would not willingly return to the scene of their trauma. So, the machine needed to execute mass social engineering, and it reached across the globe for a solution. If freed black labor was becoming expensive and assertive, the answer was to import a new, vulnerable labor force. Starting in 1838, the same year emancipation took effect, ships began to arrive from halfway across the world. They carried indentured laborers from India, bound by 5-year contracts to work the plantations. Between 1838 and 1917, over 240,000 would arrive. This is the critical, poisonous pivot in Guyanese history. This was not a benign migration. It was a strategic policy with a devastating objective, straight from the colonial playbook. First, economic warfare. To crash the bargaining power of newly freed black labor by creating a vast, replaceable pool of bound workers who could undercut their wages. Second, social sabotage. To permanently fracture the society along ethnic lines. Two large groups, introduced by the same power under different systems of oppression, placed side by side with competing economic interests. They designed the division into the foundation of the nation itself. They transformed a clear conflict between the oppressed and the oppressor into a murky, bitter competition between two oppressed groups for the favor of the master. The fracture line was now cast in concrete, and all future politics would crack along it. The 20th century arrived. The sugar plantation's physical walls had crumbled, but its shadow loomed over a new fight, the fight for the state itself. The struggle was no longer against the overseer's whip, but against the British crown. And from the divided landscape colonial policy had created, two towering figures emerged, both preaching the same gospel of anti-colonial socialism. First, Chetty Jagan, the son of Indian indentured laborers, a dentist turned activist who spoke for the sugar estate workers, the heirs to the indentured system. Beside him, Forbes Burnham, a brilliant, ambitious black lawyer from the capital who championed the urban working class and the descendants of the village movement. Together, they formed the People's Progressive Party, PPP, in 1950. It was radical, multiracial, and winning. When Guyana held its first universal suffrage elections in 1953, the PPP won in a landslide. Jagan became premier. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the manufactured divide might heal. The children of enslaved Africans and indentured Indians stood together to claim the country. And that is precisely when the third great betrayal arrived. This time wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase from Langley, Virginia. Washington and London looked at Premier Chetty Jagan and saw a Marxist, a Caribbean communist on the doorstep of South America. In the heat of the Cold War, this was unacceptable. So, they decided to rig the game. The CIA and MI6, which is basically British CIA, funded strikes, stoked racial fears, and manipulated the Constitution. Their goal was explicit: to split the multiracial PPP and install a more reliable leader. Their instrument was Forbes Burnham. In 1955, with covert external backing, Burnham split from Jagan to form his own party, the People's National Congress, or PNC. The colonial logic instantly reasserted itself. The PPP became perceived as the Indian Party, the PNC the Black Party. Politics was no longer about ideology, it was about tribal arithmetic. The state, its treasury, its army of civil service jobs, its power to grant contracts, was now the ultimate prize. The plantation had been upgraded. The government was the new plantation. Burnham, with his new backers, eventually took power. He ruled for decades, centralizing control. The PNC, drawing on black support, filled the state bureaucracy. The PPP, dominating the countryside, felt locked out. The bitter irony was complete. Two anti-colonial socialist leaders forced into a conflict designed by foreign capital, now presided over the full ethnicization of politics. The colonial strategy of divide and rule had been successfully internalized. Guyanese were now divided, and they would rule themselves in alternating turns of grievance and patronage. The battle lines for the modern political war were drawn in the 1840s, the moment the first indentured ship arrived to break the village movement. The Cold War just provided the money and the motive to make those lines permanent. So, you arrive in modern Guyana. The flags are new. The politicians are black and brown, but the game is ancient. And the rule is brutally simple. The party in power eats. This is the zero-sum logic of the ethnic state. When the PPP, perceived as the Indo-Guyanese party, holds government, its community is seen to benefit. State contracts, civil service jobs, infrastructure projects flow to its strongholds. When the PNC, the Afro-Guyanese party, is in, the patronage pendulum swings. Your access to the nation's treasury depends on your last name, your village, your vote. For many Afro-Guyanese, this has been a slow, grinding reversal of fortunes. Under Burnham's long PNC rule, they dominated the public sector, the army, the police, the ministries. It was their hard-won share of the state. But with the PPP's political resurgence in the 1990s, a new narrative took hold: the marginalization of Afro-Guyanese. The perception, backed by economic studies, is one of systemic displacement from the bureaucracy they built. The state, the one institution they had secured, began to feel like hostile territory. And then, history delivered its cruelest twist: oil, the gift or the curse, In 2015, ExxonMobil announced one of the largest offshore discoveries of the 21st century. Guyana is now on track to become one of the world's richest nations per capita. A tidal wave of money is about to hit a shore defined by 200-year-old fault lines. The question now is not just who governs, but who owns the future. The debate over the oil wealth, the oil curse, or the oil blessing is entirely filtered through the ethnic political lens. Will this be the final golden prize for the political victors? Or will it be the poison that finally breaks the system? In this pressurized environment, a quiet exodus speaks volumes. A professional brain drain is happening, particularly among the Afro-Guyanese middle class. Doctors, teachers, engineers, they are voting with their feet, leaving for the US, Canada, the UK. They are not fleeing poverty in the abstract. They are fleeing a political calculus that tells them their future is perpetually contingent on an election cycle. The cultural cost is a society living in a state of suspended segregation. Social circles, marriages, neighborhoods, often divided along the political ethnic line. The rhetoric is laced with age-old stereotypes. One side framed as grasping for total control, the other as lazy and entitled. It is the colonial script performed by new actors. The ultimate colonial success was not building a sugar colony. It was building a self-sustaining system of division. They engineered a world where the descendants of the enslaved and the indentured will be locked in a battle, convinced that their primary enemy was the other, fighting for identical scraps from a master who has long since left the table. The plantation never disappeared. It got political. It runs on ballots and oil revenues and ethnic fear. And its most harvested crop is no longer sugarcane. It's political grievance. So, what happened to the black people in Guyana? They won their freedom from chains. They bought their own land from their oppressors. They built sovereign villages from the ashes of the plantation. And then they were forced to spend every generation since defending that victory in a political war designed by the very powers they thought they had escaped. This is the ultimate case study in the machinery of erasure. It proves that white supremacy does not need white faces to survive. When it can no longer own your body, it simply reprograms the system. It owns the game. It writes the rules so perfectly that the players become convinced the other team is the source of all their problems. The fight in Guyana was never fundamentally between black and Indian. It was always between the people and the plantation. A plantation that learned to shapeshift from a field of sugarcane to a colonial bureaucracy, to an ethnic political state, and now to an oil-rich treasury. Changing the players does not mean the game is over. It just means the game has a new name. The story of Guyana is a warning written in the boldest type. Liberation is not the abolition of the system, but the seizure of its controls. And if those controls, the state, the economy, the narrative, are left attached to the old divisive wiring, the shock will cycle through every generation until Guyanese of all backgrounds confront the original blueprint, not each other. The machine, funded by history and now by oil, will continue to run, and it will produce the only thing it was ever designed to produce: division and the bitter harvest, the strange fruit that follows. Shout out to all my people from Guyana, man. I love y'all, man. I appreciate y'all. Yeah, man. I'll see y'all next video. Peace.